My favorite part of Silent Hill 2 is the cutscene that plays when you find Angela in the Blue Creek apartments. It's a really simple but beautifully made scene, and it's probably the best example of how great the game's atmosphere can be. It's so off-putting and unnerving, yet at the same time oddly comforting. The music in the scene is especially beautiful, and it's my favorite track of the game. It's also a very thematically rich scene as it sets up and builds upon a lot of the game's major ideas. But one thing that's always stuck out to me is this giant mirror in the room, as its reason for being there has never been too apparent for me. Now, the obvious answer is that it's there just because it makes the scene look cool. The mirror allows for the scene to have this really neat framing where the camera is pointed at the reflections in the mirror rather than the characters themselves, and the characters don't have to face each other directly while they're talking either. It's very striking imagery, and it's definitely a reason why the scene sticks out, but it also definitely has to have thematic implications to it. Silent Hill 2 is a game that is famous for how it uses its visual design to tell its story. Things like the enemies you encounter or the environments you explore were all meticulously crafted to be the way they look in order to convey certain themes of the game to the player. And putting this big ol' mirror here is a very obvious design choice. I mean, it takes up almost an entire wall of this room, and it's almost always in shot during the scene, so it must have some meaning behind it, and for the longest time I could never really come up with an answer that satisfied me. My first thought was that the mirror was supposed to suggest that there are a lot of similarities between the characters of James and Angela, that they are, in air quotes, reflections of one another. That idea mainly comes from this bit of dialogue.
You're the same as me. It's easier just to run. Besides, is what we deserve.
No, I'm not like you.
It definitely seems like the mirror is there to make that last line from James feel ironic, but I don't think that necessarily means it's contradicting James and implying that the characters are alike. They do both share a feeling of intense guilt and a need to be punished, and while that is one of, if not the main theme of the game, that's about where the similarities between them end. So I don't think it's an entirely accurate reading to say that the characters are meant to be foils of one another. I think the point of this scene is to give the player a hint about how James is in denial about himself. James is trying to deny being like Angela, but because the way this scene is framed, in order to say this to Angela, James is forced to say it to the mirror, and thus to his reflection. What makes James's line here feel ironic is that he's essentially looking at his own reflection and saying, nah, that ain't me. And this situation of James being in denial about who he is, even while the world around him is putting a clear image of himself right in front of him, is kind of emblematic of the entire game. I mean, James's whole story is that he's in denial about the death of his wife, Mary, both the actual events of it and his own feelings about it. But as much as James denies reality, Silent Hill is going to force him to take a good long look in the mirror. As I said before, Silent Hill 2 is famous for how it uses its enemy design to tell its story. Specifically, the way each enemy looks is supposed to relate to James's true feelings about Mary's sickness and eventual death. Most of them being about how James was frustrated that Mary's sickness was making her not hot anymore and he couldn't bang her. And accordingly, most of the enemies have a visual design that suggests both themes of sickness and sexuality. There's also this underlying theme of punishment that represents the guilt James felt for having these thoughts, and of course his guilt over, well, you know. So everything James sees in Silent Hill is so fucked up and weird because he's fucked up and weird. It's all just manifestations of his own guilt. And this is one of the few things that is clear about how the magic or demons or whatever's happening in the town of Silent Hill, is that it changes on a person-to-person basis. Whatever monsters or environment someone sees in Silent Hill is supposed to be reflective of the feelings of guilt that person holds. So you could say Silent Hill essentially acts as one big mirror. And the big mirror in the apartments is probably meant to foreshadow that idea. And it's probably not a mistake that we're given this hint in a scene with Angela, as a part of her interactions with the player is to give them insight as to how Silent Hill works, that different people see different things. Multiple times in the game, the player steps into her version of Silent Hill, which we see is completely different, with her final scene in the hotel basically outright confirming this idea.
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
And if we think of mirrors as a metaphor for this idea, then you could argue that from the very beginning, the game is trying to establish it. As the first cutscene, heck, the very first shot of the game is this very famous image of James looking at himself in the mirror. So maybe from word go, the game is trying to use this imagery to foreshadow that everything James will see in Silent Hill is just going to be himself, looking back at him. But, of course, I think there's even more that we can see in the mirror. There's another part of the apartment scene that's really interesting. In fact, it's just one specific shot of it. This shot right here is a really interesting image of Angela right next to her reflection, and I think it has a lot of meaning behind it. Now, I want you to take a minute and think about what this image reminds you of. Do you have an answer? What do you see? Do you see a butterfly, a face, or even two bears? Well, I don't think this image is actually supposed to look like anything specific. What's really important is not what this shot looks like, but rather how it's being created. On one side is Angela, and on the other is the mirror reflecting her. And this creates an image with almost perfect symmetry. There's another type of picture that's constructed in a very similar fashion. The inkblot images that are used in Rorschach tests. These inkblots all have the same bilateral symmetry that is in this shot, with one side being perfectly reflected by the other. So why is this similarity interesting? Well, during a Rorschach test, these images are shown to someone, and then they are asked to describe what objects they see in them. But the images are intentionally ambiguous. The symmetry makes it easier for our brains to identify images, but there's nothing it's supposed to look like. So whatever objects someone sees can only come from their own subconscious, from themselves. The idea behind the whole thing is that what someone sees in an inkblot image, how they interpret it, is supposed to be an insight as to what's going on in their head. In other words, the only thing people see is themselves. You could even say the inkblots work kind of like, wait for it, a mirror. You probably already see the similarities between a Rorschach test and the idea I was describing earlier, how everything James sees in Silent Hill is just what was already going on inside his head being reflected back at him. So the shot bearing a resemblance to an inkblot could be seen as yet more imagery that indicates to this idea. But it's not exactly a perfect metaphor because an inkblot doesn't magically change what it looks like when it's seen by different people. No matter who's looking at it, it's the same image. What changes from person to person is how they interpret the image, and that is what's important. So, an inkblot doesn't really represent the relationship between James and Silent Hill as well as a mirror does, but that's fine because there's another person who I think Silent Hill is meant to be an inkblot for, and that's you, the player. Most people don't like to admit it or even realize it, but however we interpret any piece of media is inevitably going to be influenced by the person that we are. We almost can't help but project the ideas that were already in our heads onto any story we see, and the parts of a story that we find significant are more than likely going to be the parts that are in some way relevant to our own lives. So in a way, how someone interprets a story could give you insight into them the same way an inkblot could. And this idea of how you interpret media acting as a sort of inkblot applies to Silent Hill 2, especially so because of how reliant the game is on its visual design. All throughout the game, you see all sorts of images and have to interpret them and say for yourself what they mean, and this process is kind of similar to what happens in a Rorschach test. Remember, the most important thing about an inkblot is that it is ambiguous. It's not intended to look like anything in particular, so whatever someone interprets it as can only be something that is coming from their own imagination. And that's what makes it work as a psychological examination. And while a lot of what you see in Silent Hill 2 is intended to look like certain things, the game is at least subtle enough that it never just comes right out and explains what the meanings behind any of the designs are. Like, there's not a scene where James sees one of the nurse enemies in the hospital and then looks directly at the camera and says, "Oh shit, that's just a sexy nurse. I bet that's related to my pent-up guilt or whatever about my dead wife." No, instead it requires the player to say for themselves that's what they think the design is supposed to represent. So in a way, it's almost forcing the player to project themselves onto the game and makes them feel like their interpretation of the game is somehow reflective of themselves. And this is where I think there's a danger for the experience of Silent Hill 2 to be kind of lessened because of how much analysis of this game is already out there. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that there's so much discussion about it, but because by now we've all heard about 100 different people's opinions on what they think the meanings behind almost everything in the game is, it's almost too easy for us to take those meanings for granted and then not pay attention and think through any of what we're seeing for ourselves. And I think coming to your own conclusions about what the symbolism means is a major part of Silent Hill 2, and it's something that a lot of people might miss out on. Like I said before, that the design of the enemies are supposed to represent sex, but that's something we all kind of take for granted because we've heard other people say it. But think about it. How can you really say that these things are representative of sexuality? How are you supposed to come to that conclusion on your own? Sure, some enemies, like the nurses, obviously have themes of sexuality, if you're into nurses and chicks with no face. But how can you say something like the lying figures are supposed to represent sex? Like, just look at them. They're just kind of gross, scabby rubber monsters that sort of flail around and spit at you. But then you see something, and it makes you go, And the first thing through your mind is probably like, oh, okay, now I get it. It's got a sexy butt. Yeah, I see how that relates to everything else that's going on. But at the same time, in the back of your head, you're also saying, wait a sec, why do I think this gross monster has a sexy butt? Is there something wrong with me? This is where everything comes back to the inkblot idea. There's nothing in the game that concretely states what the design is supposed to look like, so whatever your interpretation of it is, you're inevitably going to feel that it is then coming from yourself, and therefore is somehow saying something about you as a person. So when you focus in on this little detail of the design and your brain translates it into something kind of perverted, it feels like that then means you're secretly some sort of pervert. Now, I don't think the game is designed to be some sort of psychological examination of the player, but rather that it's designed knowing that people will feel how they interpret it is somehow a reflection of themselves. So it intentionally leads them to certain interpretations in order to elicit this exact response. I mean, there are a lot of things you see in the game, and their meaning is obvious. Painfully obvious, but no matter how close the game places these dots, it still requires the player to use their own imagination to connect them. And when you do, you feel almost guilty, like you've done something bad just for being able to form these thoughts in your head. And this is why I think making your own interpretations is so integral to Silent Hill 2, because these moments of self-disgust don't happen unless you are thinking through for yourself what you are seeing on screen. It's the process of forming your own interpretations that is terrifying. So, in a way, what the game is able to make you afraid of is yourself. And that's something that's almost unique to Silent Hill 2, and I think it's a major part of why the game is so impactful and sticks with you the way that it does. You're constantly being disturbed with yourself for being able to recognize a lot of the more perverse elements of the game. And yeah, I know it probably seems at least a little pedantic that I'm getting all of this from there just being a mirror in a room, but I do think the mirror or the inkblot or whatever version of the metaphor I'm on now does represent this design theme of ambiguity leading to this sense of self-horror, and that this theme is then present throughout a lot of the game. And really, it's just one more reason to appreciate how much thought was put into the design of this game. There's one last bit that I want to end off on that I think wraps all of this up nicely. That shot at the very beginning of the game with James looking at himself in the mirror? Well, a little while ago, someone found out that if you jack up the brightness, you can see that the eyes of James' reflection aren't actually looking back at himself, but instead are looking at the camera, at the audience, at you. So again, maybe from the very beginning, the game is trying to give you a hint that, yeah, most of what you're going to see is related to James and his issues, but maybe also, at least in some part, what you're seeing on screen, what you're being terrified by, is yourself looking back at you. Oh, and yeah, it probably also means something that my main interpretation of this game is about being terminally horny, but oh, look at that, the video's over. All right, see you next time.